Welcome everyone, bienvenue à tous. My name is Joël Castonguay-Bélanger. I'm the president of the Canadian Society for 18th Century Studies. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the first event of our 2024-25 online speaker series. This is the very first year that CSECS organizes an online series, and it is exciting to see so many of you here with us today. We hope that you enjoy the discussion and that you also join us for the other events that we've planned for you this year. This series is made possible by a dedicated group of individuals who have generously contributed their time and effort to organizing these events. Some of them are with us today. Let me introduce them to you. There's Flora Aman, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of British Columbia. Shruti Jain, a PhD candidate at Binghamton University, New York. Marianne Paquin, PhD candidate at University of Montréal. Armel Saint-Martin, professor of French literature at the University of Manitoba, and Kaushik Thakur, who is also a PhD candidate at Binghamton University, New York. So on behalf of all the members of this wonderful committee, I want to thank you all for being here. Our goal with this series is to provide an opportunity to connect with the scholarly community working on the 18th century and extend our conversations beyond our traditional in-person conference. As you may have already seen on our website, the focus of our online series this year is to discuss ideas around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and explore how these ideas relate to 18th century studies. Each of our 4 sessions planned for you this year will center on a specific theme and will take the form of a roundtable during which various speakers will be invited to discuss and share their diverse perspective on the subject. It is our hope that the conversations we engage in with our guest speakers, as well as the question that you, the audience, will ask them, will encourage CSEC members and all the 18th century scholars to find their own productive ways to approach questions around equity, diversity, and inclusion in their teaching, their research, and in the specific context of their institutions. Indeed, working on the 18th century today implies confronting the criticism addressed to the text of the past because of the discourses and representations of exclusion and oppression that they often convey. These debates on equity, diversity, and inclusiveness engage the very definition of the Enlightenment. So it therefore seemed essential to us to address them. So following today's inaugural events, we will meet again on Friday, November the 29th at the same time for a second roundtable, this time titled Thinking Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion with the Enlightenment. This time we've invited speakers to reflect on a provocative, if not paradoxical question. How did 18th century writers think of inclusion, equity, and diversity? And how can their work help us to reflect on these topics today? We'll have the great pleasures to welcome Catherine Binhammer from University of Alberta, Emily Friedman from Auburn University, Sal Nicolazzo at the University of California, Davis, and Surya Parekh from Binghamton University as our panelists. We've also scheduled a third session in February to discuss the concept of norms and diversity in the 18th century. And finally, in March, to honor the bilingual nature of our society, we'll have a panel in French this time to discuss the old and new challenges of teaching the history, literature, and philosophy of the Enlightenment today. So if you haven't already done so, please visit our website, and I'm going to include the URL here in the chat box. Please visit our website and subscribe to our newsletter to learn more about each of these events and find information on how to register. As you may already have noticed, today's roundtable, as well as all our other online events this year, will be recorded and made available on the website afterward. So if you're not comfortable with having your image online, please feel free to just turn off your camera or use the chat box during the question and answer period. Before we get to introduce our 4 speakers for today, I'd like to invite one of the organizers of this series, Kaushik Thakur, to say a few words about today's theme, the Enlightenment and the idea of the university.
Sure. Thanks everyone again for taking the time to be here, and thanks to all our speakers for agreeing to be a part of this conversation without any hesitation. When we were thinking about the speaker series as a whole, something that CSECS could explore as part of the EDI initiatives, it seemed appropriate for us to then start the conversation probing, on the one hand, the 18th century university space, and on the other hand, its legacies today that we still engage and work with and within. Whereas we identify the university as an institution with strong relations to settler colonialism, we also see settler colonial forces repeatedly targeting universities. And we were thinking maybe we can sit with the seeming paradox today a little bit and think through institutions that enable genocides, which necessarily seem to involve scholasticide or more broadly epistemicide. We have a wonderful set of speakers today who can engage us in a meaningful dialogue about some of these conversations. They've been at the forefront of thinking about questions pertaining to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They've navigated the university space carefully in addressing these questions and often at great risk to their own personal and professional comfort. Hopefully, we can turn these spaces and relations, enabled as they are by universities, into the undercommons of the same universities. And as Motin and Harney would remind us through Shakespeare, perhaps the university will steal and there will steal. And with that, maybe I'll just introduce all of our speakers for today. Eugenia Zuroski has been a member of the Department of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University since 2009. Gina is author of the book, A Taste for China, English Subjectivity and the Prehistory of Orientalism, which argues that Chinoiserie played an integral role in the formation of modern English subjectivity. And she's also the author of A Funny Thing, 18th Century Literature Undisciplined, forthcoming from Cambridge University Press, which argues that 18th century culture provides politically relevant invitations for us to think and relate to the world in ways that run counter to liberal self-discipline. Gina has published articles in Novel, A Forum on Fiction, 18th Century Studies, Journal 18, and Literature Compass, and she has served since 2010 as editor of the journal 18th Century Fiction. The recipient of 2 SSHRC Insight grants, Gina is currently working on a book that explores the problem of diaspora literacies through a study of her own Chinese genealogy. Gina currently serves as president of the Council of Editors of Learned Journals and is a founding member of the Bigger Six Collective. She has published poems in Columba, Room, Cantheus, Action, Spectacle, Protean, and Best Canadian Poetry 2021, as well as chapbooks from Anstruther's Press and Model Press. Our next speaker, Brian Cowan, has been a professor of early modern British and European history at McGill University in Montreal for the last 20 years. He's the author of The Social Life of Coffee, The Emergence of the British, I'm sorry about all the noise behind, this is Diwali in India, which was awarded the Wallace K. Ferguson Prize by the Canadian Historical Association in 2006. His second book, The State Trial of Dr. Henry Sackville, uses book history to provide a new understanding of the most important political trial of the 18th century. He was a member of the Multigraph Collective responsible for interacting with print, elements of reading in the era of print saturation, University of Chicago Press 2018, which studies 18th and 19th century print cultures as part of a multimedia environment. He has recently edited A Cultural History of Fame in the Age of Enlightenment for Bloomsbury Academic and is currently editing the Oxford Handbook of History of the European Enlightenment with Professor Valerie Capdeville. He also edits the monograph series Cultures of Early Modern Europe for Bloomsbury Academic with Professor Beat Cumin. He is a founding member of the international research group, I hope I don't butcher this, Sociability du Long the Huitième Siècle, 1650 to 1850. His additional publications on the history of early modern taste have ranged from studies of art, auctions, and connoisseurship to gastronomy and food writing. Next speaker, Kerry Sinanan, is assistant professor in global pre-1800 literature and culture at Winnipeg University. And before joining Winnipeg, she taught for 5 years in the University of Texas system. She specializes in the Black Atlantic, Caribbean slavery and race, and the global dimensions of Black resistance and abolition up to the present. Her monograph, Myths of Mastery, Traders, Planters, and Colonial Agents, 1750 to 1834, examines the writing in various genres by slave traders and slave owners from the mid-18th century up to British emancipation, 1834. She's under contract with Broadview Press to produce a new edition of the history of Mary Prince, 1831. As an anti-racist pedagogy practitioner, she runs regular teach-ins and workshops on undisciplining 18th and 19th century studies and on decolonial curriculum. Our next speaker, Sophia Rosenfeld, is Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania. where she teaches European and American intellectual and cultural history with a special emphasis on the Enlightenment, the transatlantic age of revolutions, and the legacy of the 18th century for modern democracy. Her newest book to be published by Princeton University Press in February 2025 is entitled The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in Modern Life. It explores how, between the 17th century and the present, the idea and practice of making choices from menus of options came to shape so many aspects of our existences, from consumer culture to human rights, and with what consequences. She's also the author of A Revolution in Language, The Problem of Science in Late 18th Century France, Common Sense, A Political History, which won the Mark Linton History Prize and the Society for the History of Early American Republic Book Prize, and Democracy and Truth, A Short History. And from 2013 to 2017, she co-edited the journal Modern Intellectual History. Thank you all once again for taking the time being with us today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Kaushik. So Brian Cowan, Sophia Rosenfeld, Kerry, Sinanan, and Eugenia Zuroski, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Joining us now will be Shruti Jain, who will be the co-moderator of the panel with me. So I'd like to maybe start by laying the ground for today's discussion and ask you to maybe talk a little bit about each of you think of the mission of that thing that we call the university. The four of you have different backgrounds, different expertise, different research interests, but you have all in common that you, like myself and like many other people here, work in an institution that has existed for centuries. Of course, many aspects of the way a university function today in North America have little to do with the way a university functioned in, say, the 13th century Europe. But some would argue that its core mission hasn't changed much. Some would say that it is the pursuit of truth, while others would prefer to say maybe it is to produce new knowledge. So I'd like to know how each of you define the mission of a university, and maybe turn to Sophia to answer first. And remember to unmute.
Am I okay now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I'm happy to get this conversation started on that topic. And let me thank the organizers first for putting together what really looks to be a very promising conversation. I hope it will be. Universities are very hard to talk about with a single mission statement these days because they do an awful lot of things. And it can vary very much by institution. Some are also major entertainment venues for their region. Some are sports powerhouses. Some are training centers for all sorts of different endeavors. But if we want to get to sort of what's at the core of a university, which I think it's important to articulate these days, I'd say there's several things. One, before we even talk about new knowledge, I think part of the function of universities is preservationist, in the sense that it's important that they preserve culture and the learning of the past. They're kind of repositories for what's come before, in part, which is why we teach, for instance, subjects that are not entirely about the present. The other function they have is, as you say, I would prefer probably not the word truth, but I like knowledge maybe better, to produce new knowledge, or maybe we could even say new ways of seeing the world, which requires also the possibility of challenging past ways of seeing the world. So there's a kind of preservationist part, but there's also a challenge to that preservation, which we hope, whether that's in the sciences or in literature, to help generate new ways of seeing the world that break out of existing paradigms. And then finally, universities exist to disseminate those effects to students, but also more broadly, often in ways that can either help the public good in some form or simply get new ideas out into circulation. All of those, I think, are kind of integral to what the modern university is. And if we lose sight of them, of course, and we focus too much on some of the other aspects of universities, say job preparation or sports complex or executive training or all the other things that they do in different forms, I think we lose the sort of argument for why they should exist. So I take those sort of three prongs to be fundamental to just making the case in the public sphere for the purpose of the university.
Thank you so much. Eugenia.
Thank you. And I want to echo Sophia's thanks to the organizers and to my fellow speakers. It's really an honor to be here with all of you today. I took some very quick notes just before the cameras went on this question, and I found myself in these notes offering an idea of what the mission of the university is that I think is maybe deceptively simple in concept, but immediately complicated in practice. And so what I wrote is that the university, the mission of the university is to operate as a site for supporting and facilitating collective knowledge work, which I think echoes exactly what Sophia was just saying, that the core function of the university, as it's been kind of imagined as an institution, at least since the 18th century, has been as a place in the world that centers the aspect of human existence and human, interaction that is around knowledge, and not just knowledge as something we make and that we share and that we have or don't have, but knowledge specifically as a collective practice, as something that we are constantly doing, and that ideally we do together. It's complicated because I think that one of the things we are, professional academics, not for the first time, but certainly like right now, are running up against, is that mission requires a certain commitment, institutional commitment, to what I would call a radical hospitality, which again is an idea that comes, that is born alongside the concept of the modern university in the age that we study, the 18th century. But I think radical hospitality is a condition, a necessary condition of bringing the diverse epistemological orientations that the university promises to put into generative, relation with one another, peaceful and generative relation with one another. And that is a really hard commitment to live up to in a sustained way. I think it's one worth committing to and worth doing. But I think that we're witnessing institutions kind of running up against the limitations of their ability to do that in a time of global war, genocide, and other kinds of massive, large-scale crises. So I think that I want to finish by saying that I consider the university a place that attends seriously to the question of learning conditions and learning environments, and that centers pedagogy, right? Meaning that broad practice of shared, constant, perpetual interpersonal learning, collective learning, that centers pedagogy as a shared and a reciprocal endeavor, right? Not a funneling of some kind of wealth, knowledge as wealth to the people who are ready to receive it, but this place where people can interact in a way where we are really constantly learning from one another. And that requires a commitment to maintaining certain standards of peace and safety, not just in the individual university community, but as a value that connects the university to the world.
Very interesting. Thank you. Many echoes between already our first two speakers, and yet some nuances between the two definitions. I'd like to turn now maybe to Kerry to continue. And remind Kerry to unmute as well.
Thank you. Always remind. Thank you to all of you for organising this, and to CSECS for the invitation. And I just want to open by saying that I am speaking here from Treaty 1 territory, which is the territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji-Cree nations. I'm speaking very close to the University of Winnipeg, which is the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe peoples. Treaty 1 was signed in 1871, taking this territory from 7 local Anishinaabe First Nations in order to make the land available for settler use and ownership. And I want to say that this land acknowledgement is given as an expression of respect and appreciation for these ancestors and present-day relatives who continue to love and care for and steward the land. And I think it's, to connect that land acknowledgement to the university, I don't think the mission of universities has ever been unproblematically to pursue truth, because it's immediately a selective and exclusive entity. So what I'm going to say here is probably not going to resonate as much with the last two answers, because I think I'm thinking of the institution as an aspect of colonial power and as a part of the state and its apparatuses. And we only have to look at the wholesale scholasticide in Palestine, where to see the truth of this. Universities have been obliterated by Israeli genocide and funded explicitly by US and Canadian and German and British arms trading deals, many of which our universities have material and economic ties to. So the whole aspect of BDS is fundamentally tied into the universities that we all sit in as part of enabling, enacting and perpetuating various types of genocide, including here on Turtle Island. So we can broadly think of the university's relationship to Indigenous knowledge systems and how it disregards these as a very starting point. The very first university, the University of Al-Qarawiyyin, was founded in 895 by a woman, Fatima Al-Firi, and has the oldest library in the world. And then we had the European universities emerge. The Constituta Habiba of the University of Bologna establishes what we might recognize today as the foundation or the blueprint for what we call academic freedom. But that freedom was always linked to power, and who gets to say what power is. So what becomes truth? I mean, we might think of the moment in Hamlet where Hamlet wants to return to the University of Wittenberg and Claudius says no, precisely because Hamlet's returning there would overthrow monarchical power and claims to divine rights. But universities today continue to be bastions of colonial power that serve overwhelmingly white male patriarchy and the ruling classes across the board. I taught in Texas for 5 years, but the Board of Governors of University of Texas systems are directly appointed by the governor. So they are political appointees, and we're seeing these clashes play out in various realms. That's the sacking of Claudine Gay at Harvard University, for example, but also we're then seeing increasingly university presidents as corporate and state servants that become increasingly conjoined to the fascistic structures, especially in the US, where the government solely exists to serve corporate demands. And this is part of why public funding is being withdrawn from the universities. So the universities are becoming increasingly dependent on private funds. So we're faced with this conundrum that if the university's mission is to educate and pursue truth, then that is not wanted within a racial capitalist neoliberal system. And so that's where I think maybe what the university is, I'm thinking of it more as an ideological state apparatus, as opposed to how I think of what I want to do within the university. There's a huge tension there. My own alma mater, Trinity College Dublin, had from its very inception a colonial mission. It was established by the Royal Charter of Elizabeth I in 1592 to consolidate Tudor rule of the Pale and to explicitly secure a Protestant ascendancy. The legacies of that are very tangible today in Ireland, where the ruling class is a propertied, owning ruling class, which still is genociding the original Indigenous inhabitants of Ireland, travellers. Trinity is still a sister college of St. John's, Oxford and Oriel at Cambridge. And so those Anglo ties remain in place. Catholics weren't allowed in, and then they were banned from going in by the Catholic Church precisely because they worried about the kinds of indoctrination that would happen. And then just to finish off, thinking of the University of Winnipeg, where I am now, the main building that you see, the nice building at the front, on the front lawn, that sits on the Trans-Canadian Highway, by the way, another colonial passageway, was established, Wesley College, by George Young in 1888, who was a Methodist minister, who was a missionary at the Red River Settlement, and so named after Wesley. And George Young actually has ties to where you hear my accent from, which is the north of Ireland, because he ministered to Thomas Scott, who was one of the prime rebels against Louis Riel here in the Red River Uprising. And so these were, loyalist Orangemen, Protestants, who thought native people in the area were savages. And ultimately Louis Riel himself was executed for being a traitor. So I think I want to think about the university in terms of its role in state power.
Right. Thank you. And finally, Brian.
Right. Well, thank you. I would just like to, as with the other speakers, thank CSECS and all the organizers for inviting me, and thanks to the other speakers for enlightening me on their thoughts as well. I'm looking forward to a productive discussion. I suppose, the university, it may be a very traditional sort of view, but I do see it as, a place for creating new knowledge and imparting knowledge, preserving knowledge as well. I think Sophia's opening comments, struck me as resonating very much with my own thoughts. I mean, particularly as a professor of humanities, there's a preservationist aspect to humanities teaching that exists along with constructing new knowledge, and we're often torn between the two of them. Although even our sense of what is, important to preserve changes over time, and so that's always an interesting thing. Research universities, which I think was implicit in the question, do prioritize the creation of new knowledge. And certainly when I arrived at McGill, that was one thing that was really hammered into my head, is you've got to be creating new knowledge and go out and seek grants to do this, which I sort of was already doing before, but hadn't really thought explicitly about doing that in my graduate training, particularly, partly I think because of this preservationist impulse within humanities research as well. So we're also often taught that our jobs consist of three things: research, teaching, and service. Research being the construction of new knowledge, teaching being the educational mission of imparting that knowledge and conserving it for our students, and then service too, which is I think at best a form of self-governance. The universities should be forums for us governing ourselves, and that's an issue that's been difficult to preserve, particularly given the structures of universities. I'm certainly seeing in my own university right now that whole system of self-governance being rethought pretty radically. We'll see. I mean, McGill's sort of famously been one of the few universities in Canada without any faculty labor unions, and it looks like that's changing. It's not complete yet, but the law faculty has a recognized labor union now. There are several other faculties at McGill that are in the same process, and that will change the form of governance in the university simply because of the laws of collective bargaining and such. So that's the university, but I think it's also worth keeping in mind that the universities exist within a whole ecosystem of other forms of education as well, and that's worth keeping in mind. One of my own experiences in higher education has been moving from colleges to universities. I did my BA not at a university, but at a liberal arts college in the United States, and I'm glad I did that because I learned a massive amount. That was an institution where teaching was the primary mission of the institution, which meant that my instructors gave me a lot of time to learn and to help me develop as an intellectual and ultimately as a future academic. And that's a lot of hard work. I mean, we do that in universities as well. We certainly strive to do it at McGill, but it's actually harder at a research university to do, simply because of scale and such, and particularly with fiscal pressures on universities now, that's going to become ever harder. We just had a department meeting earlier this week where we were, forewarned about budget cuts coming down the line, even though we don't even know what our budget will be because the governments that decide these things haven't made those decisions. And so there's no way to plan when you haven't actually been told what you're working with. But clearly the direction is one in which one will have to direct less time to individual instruction simply because there are so many hours in the day and not as many instructors. So the university, plays many roles, but I think that the core, mission of creating and preserving knowledge is really at the heart of it.
Well, thank you. And just to use Eugenia's words, deceptively simple question can lead to very complex answers. And now it's very useful to know where each of you will be speaking from today. So now I'll turn maybe to Shruti and invite her to ask the second question.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. You have really offered us wonderful ideas to think about, like Joel said, with a deceptively simple question. And I feel like in one way or the other, you have all invoked the complexities we sit with as we work at these universities. I want to maybe invite you to turn to the 18th century and share with us if there are ideas, philosophers, writers, or literature that you draw from, engage with, to reflect on your research, teaching, and negotiations with the university at large. We could start with any of you, if you. Maybe Gina, since I could just do that for you.
I was like, don't call on me. I didn't prepare for this question, but I'll come up with an answer. I think I do actually wish that I'd maybe thought ahead to give a better answer than this, but I'm going to give you my most spontaneous, off-the-cuff answer, which is kind of coming out of this book project, that the Funny Thing book project that I actually finished quite a long time ago, but then the manuscript had an adventure, and so it's now in production with Cambridge. It should be coming out quite soon. But one of the central figures that I think about in that book is Horace Walpole, who is a little bit of a weird. He's a weird figure to call upon for multiple reasons, I think, in response to this question. He's, I would not call Horace Walpole a radical. I would not call him, someone who, who has lived knowledge, or had lived knowledge that came from beyond the realm of the, like the most privileged, white male elites of 18th century Britain. But I find Walpole a really inspiring figure to think with and to share with students, in particular, to introduce students to, because he's a weirdo, because he took the money and the wealth and the privilege that he had, and I'm not an apologist for Walpole's wealth. I'm not saying it was rightfully channeled to him. It was, like all wealth that was gathering and being hoarded in 18th century England. It was blood money. But I think he's an example of someone who kind of received cultural rewards, and ones that entailed a certain level of like implied cultural and ideological indebtedness. And he used his privilege to like largely ignore those debts and use his wealth to cultivate forms of friendship and community, and to devote his life to weird creative projects in a way that really was not what wealth of that kind was imagined to be for in the emergent imperial economy of mid-18th century England. And so in some ways, I like to place Walpole, and not just him as an individual, but the kinds of circles that he facilitated, right? Particularly queer and domestically oriented creative circles that were also social and kinship circles at the center of the version of 18th century England that I like to introduce students to, or people who are not very familiar with 18th century culture, because I think it's a beautiful example of the way that people imagine ways of living slightly, wayward or maybe very wayward from the kinds of channels of ways of living, ways of relating that are laid out as, increasingly as kind of givens or common sense as the 18th century progresses.
Should I go ahead here? Should I jump in?
Sure, sure.
Okay, thank you, Shruti, for the question. I mean, I think there's a difference sometimes between texts we love to teach, because there were always some texts that just work super well, right? And texts that are good for our own thinking. And I think if you're asking about the latter, I might say in some ways this is going to be a very conventional answer, but we come back to great texts of the past mainly to understand them and to wrestle with them, not to endorse them. I never think of any text that I teach as something I'm either standing on the side of or against. My job is to introduce its possibilities and to let people think with it. And I think in some ways, if you come back to the classic, very short, very dense text of Kant, What is Enlightenment? You are it's good for you, and it is good for students too, but it's good for you in the sense that it reintroduces this idea that we are constantly should be challenging ourselves to leave our own adolescence, nonage, whatever it gets called in your translation, behind. Your adolescence as a thinker, which is the one in which you feel deferential to past texts or past teachers or your family or other entities. Not that you shouldn't come back to that, but it gives you the opening, I think, and the permission in some ways to say, how does this look if I try to just read this on its own terms, to use this kind of critical thinking that the Enlightenment introduces, and that somebody even like Foucault says is really the most resuscitatable part of the Enlightenment for our own purposes, to think about the world around us. And I love the way that the Enlightenment, for all its upsides and its downsides, offers this kind of challenge to say, what happens if you rethink this problem? And you may have to obey in some capacities. Even with academic freedom, we can't go into the classroom and start talking about something that has absolutely no relation to what we've been hired to teach. That's performing our job in some ways. We don't have complete academic freedom, doesn't mean complete freedom at all. There are lots of things we can't do in the classroom. But we do have this very particular kind of freedom, which is to put texts and ideas into conversation with sentiments of the past, sentiments of the present, to historicize them, but also to use them to think about the present. I also think there's one little more important thing here. We shouldn't feel superior to the people in the past. We too, if we say that, the money of the past is compromised, so is ours. The people in the past had their biases and prejudices, so do we. People in the past relied on forms of enforced labor, so do we. We shouldn't let our students feel better than people in the past. We should see them as people in different moments grappling with ideas and do the same. And I consider that to be sort of one of the great things that a student can take away from any class, is the possibility of reading, historicizing, trying to understand first where some idea comes from, but then grappling with what does it mean for us, and taking that as sort of two stages. And I consider 18th century texts to be exceptionally good for doing this of all sorts. But a lot of the texts I like to teach are fairly canonical, Mary Wollstonecraft, for instance, because they're very good for still thinking with. So I'll stop there.
Should I join in? Yeah, okay. One of the things we were asked to think about the relationship between the Enlightenment and the university, and I think one of the first things that occurred to me when I was thinking on this topic is, well, universities weren't really where the Enlightenment was happening, so to speak, in the 18th century, and so most of the Enlightenment that I engage with and that I teach and such is outside of the university setting. So I mean, the works that I often like to go to, I mean, partly because I find them very interesting, but they're also very teachable, are the periodical essay form in the 18th century, which becomes a very popular form of writing. Addison and Steele, the Tatler and the Spectator, very interesting stuff going on in there. The essays of the third Earl of Shaftesbury or David Hume particularly. And none of these people are engaged with university teaching at all. In fact, they don't really like it. I mean, Hume famously, couldn't get a job as the great infidel. No university would ever hire him. And that's a whole, Enlightenment spirit, is that the pursuit of knowledge and enlightenment takes place outside of traditional centers of learning. Addison and Steele famously said that they were going to bring philosophy out of the cloisters and into the coffee houses and the tea tables of the nation. And so that's that's a big part of the Enlightenment ideal, and it's quite interesting to teach. It relates to the history of sociability, which isn't related only to the 18th century, but it's particularly important for the 18th century. And sociability is really, a form informal socialization. I mean, the university today is so bureaucratic, and I mean, my own university just is huge. My career has been one in which I've gone from smaller institutions to bigger and bigger ones, and it's by the time you get to a really large place, there's it's hard to carve out spaces of sociability there. And in fact, even in the university that I see, the older spaces of sociability are starting to wither away, even student bars and such, which used to be, at least to think they were like the coolest places on campus. And now they're either shut down for renovations or various reasons. They're not as accessible. And so sociability, I think, is really a key part of this. And I like to think of teaching as a sociable experience as well. A lot of the real action and teaching happens informally, after the class, where you have an informal conversation with a student, or I invite students to come to office hours as frequently as possible, so we can just talk about what they're interested in on a one-to-one basis. And so that's a key thing. That whole concept of sociability, and the theorists of sociability in the 18th century, I think, are very important for that work.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think this conversation is very exemplary to me of how I've always felt in spaces of 18th century discussion, which is very much at odds with the normalization of a period that I come at as one of intense violence, genocide, slavery. The people I teach and study are Mary Prince, Alauda Equiano. I'm president of the Early Caribbean Society, and we just had a big virtual global conference on Equiano, so I encourage everybody to go and look at that, especially at Shruti and Kaushik's incredible panel on digital worlds of Equiano. But I wanted to study Caribbean literature from the 18th century onwards in Trinity College Dublin as a PhD student, and there wasn't anybody to supervise that particular area, and so I've always come at this very much like my Trinidadian counterparts, with a double consciousness. So somebody like C.L.R. James says Beethoven is for everybody, but how C.L.R. James listens to Beethoven is very different to how his white academic counterparts might listen to Beethoven, or how they might think of it in the world. And I would be coming at the Enlightenment with a view from Aimé Césaire, which is that blood seeps through the cracks of the edifices the Enlightenment. And so my project always in the classroom is to unmask the period as one of thorough white supremacy. Kant was a thoroughgoing white supremacist. I would never teach Kant without making this very, very clear, that he invented biological aspects of racialized difference based on the diaries and lies of enslavers like Edward Long. And these become knowledge and these become truth, and we're living with it right now. We have the same languages that Edward Said has been telling us about from the 1970s in Orientalism, where we have Netanyahu using the language of the Enlightenment. We are the children of light, they are the children of darkness. We are saving the civilized West against savages. I feel it's our responsibility as scholars of the period to unmask this language, always as genocidal language. Figures like Oliver Goldsmith, there's a statue of him at the front of Trinity College Dublin, where I went to university, put me on a chain of being where I'm several rungs down below the majority white college students I had to study in. And this becomes normalized. The history of Earth and animated nature is actually a foundational text for eugenicist Victorian thinking, and yet Goldsmith is currently being celebrated. I'm in one of the volumes, but he's currently being celebrated for his sociability. So I think these words are loaded, and we have to keep thinking of what Quijano talks, the destruction of the coloniality of knowledge, because I would. My plea, I mean, I tend not to go to events organized very much by ASECS and CSECS, because this very relationship becomes quite difficult to navigate. And I would wish that these institutions would be a lot less celebratory of the period and start to be a lot more critical of the ways in which 18th century writers like Colonel Devasty unveiling colonialism. It's not like we don't have many voices from this period screaming Ottabo Cugoano and so on, that the very foundational principles of Enlightenment humanism are at the expense of Indigenous Black genocide. And so one of my scholarly goals is, and in the classroom, is to situate the Caribbean at the heart rather than at the edges of the Enlightenment. And I'll just quote from Michel Rolf Trouillot, who reminds us that the Haitian Revolution, quote, challenged the ontological and political assumptions of the most radical writers of the Enlightenment. The events that shook up Saint-Dominique from 1791 to 1804 constituted a sequence for which not even the extreme political left in France or England had a conceptual frame of reference. They were unthinkable facts in the framework of Western thought. And so, something that was happening was not even possible within Enlightenment knowledge systems. And we can see that right now today as Haiti faces a global invasion headed by the US, again, on these bases that it cannot rule itself, deeply racist. And CLR James calls his book The Black Jacobins precisely as a contrapuntal title, because he's telling us that the real Jacobins are Black Jacobins. The real people where the real revolutionaries are not in France. So that's my project in the text that I teach. And Mary Prince comes right from the Bahamas, from Bermuda, from Antigua, right into the Abolitionist Society in London, to tell English people, you don't know anything, and you're lying to yourselves, because the scars on my back are the proof of what English politeness, English sympathy, English materialism, that's what happens.
Thank you, Sherry, for this answer. I think our goal. Sorry.
Can
yes,
I
go
add
ahead,
one
Sophia.
thing? I just want to clarify that and I hope I said this the first time, but I'm not teaching Kant in a celebratory way. I'm not interested in the idea, and I assume others are not either, that this isn't a kind of exaltation of kind of greatness in any way. It's exactly the opposite. It's an attempt to understand and then its attempt to engage with. It can be, but I don't think it has to be an either or, that there's a sort of celebration or a denigration are the two possibilities. The possibilities are much more wide-ranging than that. It's to understand the mixture of things that come together. I don't think any text is always anything. It's used a lot of different ways in different moments. They're reappropriated. And my point about us is that if blood seeps through in the 18th century, which it surely does, and we all teach of, I think we all teach now, for instance, the Haitian Revolution is as central as the French Revolution, that the texts we teach are a wide range of different voices, much wider than the canon that maybe we were all educated to read. But that said, if blood seeps through in the 18th century, I don't see that it seeps through any less now. I mean, this is the universal condition of in some ways, I don't see any real difference in some ways between our world and theirs. I mean, we could say that, yes, in certain ways, certain kinds of forced labor, for instance, slavery obviously doesn't exist in the same form, but we're probably all wearing clothing. I didn't look at the label of my shirt, but it was made in some part of the world where we have very little sense of what the labor conditions were that produced the very garments that we're wearing as we sit here doing this broadcast. We eat foods and products that constantly are made in conditions that I think would be morally reprehensible. And that's not to excuse it in any way, but it's simply to say that it's hard for me to see, to not see kind of doubleness all the time in different cultural moments, in different texts, as products of complex webs of politics, economics, cultural assumptions, geopolitics. So I'm not at all disputing what Kerry says, but I just simply wanted to clarify that I did not mean to suggest in any way that we read canonical texts because these are the greats or something like that, and we forgot about all the rest of it. It's to say that these are texts that are rich for us to understand the complexity and even the relation between the idea of, say, critical thinking and the fact that slavery is one of the dominant economic systems in the world, that those coexist. That's something students need to know, and we need to know. So I'll get off my soapbox now. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just quickly come back with it. It's not. I'm not saying either that we should not teach these thinkers at all. But what I'm saying, I don't agree with how you're analyzing the systemic power, because I think what I'm saying is that when we teach this period, we need to teach it as one that made white supremacy in very particular material ways that lay the foundations for our neoliberal world today that remain with us. And we are not a we. When we're talking to Black students in our classrooms, their wealth is certainly not inherited from the spoils of enslavement. When we're talking to Indigenous students, we're not a we. I think that's something we really have to disrupt as well. International students pay 4 times the fees that domestic students pay here in the University of Winnipeg, while they're facing an enormous national backlash against their very existence. We continue to harvest the material wealth and extraction of labour in our system. So that we is already disrupted, and it makes the idea of sociability very, very difficult when you've got international students paying 4 times the fees. But I'll get off my soapbox now for now.
Well, thank you. I think the last point offers us a good segue to where I was hoping the conversation would now take us, which are precisely questions around diversity and the disruptions or challenges that we may want to pose to the 18th century, and also the way the universities function today. Very few people, I think, today would argue that diversity is not important in higher education. We all know that institutions are under increasing pressure, not only to talk about DEI initiatives, but to embed these principles deeply into their culture, operations, and policy. However, the road for advancing diversity is sometimes bumpy, as not everyone agrees on the definition, the role, and the implementation of diversity initiatives. So what are your thoughts on the way the term diversity is currently used in academia? Starting with whoever wants to go first.
I'll jump in again because I feel like it's been a while. I'll get us started. So I'm currently teaching a graduate seminar called Anti-Colonial Pedagogies in our department. It was created, I didn't create it, I was on sabbatical. The department added a course that's called something like Decolonial, Anti-Oppressive, Anti-Racist, et cetera, pedagogies, thinking and learning otherwise. And then I came back from sabbatical and they said, we need someone to teach this course. Will you teach it? And I've been around long enough to like see an opportunity when it presents itself. And so I said, I will do this favor for the department. I want it like marked down in someone's memory as a favor, and on the condition that I can teach it however I want. And it was granted because it had to be taught and there was nobody else who was going to do it. So I just call it anti-colonial pedagogies. We open the semester by talking about why I shift the title from like this laundry list that begins with decolonial. We have a conversation about how we're not yet at a point where actual decolonial work can be done in a formal setting in the colonial institution of the university, but anti-colonial work might be able to. And then this semester is going to be dedicated to thinking about anti-colonial pedagogy in theory, but also crucially in practice. And so much of the substance of the course is then experimenting with what is actually possible. Like, what can you actually think? But more importantly, what can you actually do as an educator within the material parameters of the particular institution, in this case, McMaster University, right? On the colonized territories of, the dish with one spoon. What is possible? What's not possible? And what most of the stuff falls in this middle ground is like possibly possible, but hard, right? Hard to figure out, hard to manage, hard to pull off. So we just read this great essay that I love by Ronaldo Walcott that came out in, I think it was Social Text in 2019, called The End of Diversity for this past Monday's class. And I really do recommend it to everyone who is interested in this question of diversity as both a value and a practice espoused by the contemporary university. And Walcott is who taught at OISE for many, many years and is now at the University of Buffalo, I believe. He approaches the question of diversity from a Black studies perspective, and he calls quite overtly for the end of diversity as an institutional initiative on the terms in which it's kind of achieved this status as an administrative, kind of principle. And one of the things I love about this essay is that I think, because he's a wonderful writer, and when he talks about the end of diversity, he's really appealing to the double valence of the word end. He's calling for us to cease, like practicing things in the name of diversity and inclusion that are not solving the problems or creating better learning conditions along the lines that they might have been theorized, before diversity became an institutional initiative. But it's also calling our attention back to the idea that to the extent that diversity initiatives are something that we are responsible for thinking about and enacting, they should have an end. They should have objectives. And that one of the effects of turning diversity work into a kind of tangentially academic career is that it loses sight of its own end. Because if you achieve the goals of diversification, you don't need to keep doing diversity work, right? So it's like calling our attention back to the idea of an end or an objective to kind of reclaim what now often gets called diversity work or equity work from the space of like institutional corporate capture. Right? Where it's a space that on some level, the institution, the culture doesn't want to ever end, doesn't want the problem to be solved, because then what do we do with all these people who have organized their lives and careers around this particular field of activity? And I'll just say, crucially, in the piece, what Walcott is kind of pointing our attention to throughout is the problem of whiteness, that what we've now developed, this very kind of like robust-ish, but mostly like recursive language for in like institutional versions of diversification, equity work, that what doesn't often get talked about directly as the thing that the end of diversity work should be focused on is the end of white supremacy, right? Is like actually working on the problem of whiteness as a structure, as a system of inequity, right? That actually needs material attending to and dismantling. So that's my recommendation.
Thanks for this recommendation. I wrote it down. We'd like to continue on that. Your thought on the terms, the use of the term diversity.
I think it's interesting that diversity has now been sort of weaponized to do a lot of different things simultaneously in the political space. And sometimes it stands for two really different objectives, it seems to me. Sometimes it stands for ways of the general ambition of opening up, say, the professoriate or the student body to people who've traditionally been excluded or marginalized within it. And that can be described as an effort at increasing diversity. But sometimes it stands for something different, which is pluralism within, say, a group that's whether it's your faculty or your classroom, in which case people will add things like ideological diversity, meaning we want to have the widest range of viewpoints, backgrounds, positions in our space for the sake of the learning experience itself, which is a very different objective from the one of opening up space for people who've been traditionally excluded from those spaces. And they get used rather interchangeably. And the latter one has now become sometimes a conservative weapon. There are bills in places like Indiana that, you must have a diversity of viewpoints in the classroom, are precisely a kind of counterattack on the first kind of diversity, using a term in this double sense. And that happens with most political terms, that there's a way that they get co-opted and repurposed and reused to new ends. But I think it's something that we don't often disentangle enough. And it seems to me, therefore, if you just speak in a bland way about I'm for diversity, it doesn't mean anything. It's a kind of meaningless idea at this point. You'd have to really clarify what kind of diversity and towards what ultimate goals. So I like this idea of the end of diversity. I don't know the article, but I'm certainly intrigued because I like the idea of both questioning that end goal and thinking about what it would mean for it to succeed. What would that look like? And is that a place we want to get to? Or is that just a kind of bland idea of, we're all here together kind of thing? So intriguing.
Thank you, Sophia. Kerry, Brian, anything to add?
Well, I was just going to hop in with, some statistics of, especially from Canadian higher ed, which is truly, truly appalling. If we look at the diversity statistics, we're not letting in. It's still a predominantly white institution, and in fact, this is more pertinent to where I was teaching, which was Texas, the University of Texas system, which was explicitly doing the kind of thing that has just been discussed, centering diversity of opinion and marking diversity itself as a discriminatory practice because it's picking out people on the grounds of racialized identity. But of course, we now are facing here in Canada the implementation of the IHRA definition, for example, of anti-Semitism, which will prohibit criticism of the Israeli state. And so diversity of opinion is not going to be allowed. And our predominantly white labour unions within the university even up to the task of combating that? Because really, what Gina said is the key, or via Ronaldo Walcott, which is until we tackle, and that's why I'm sorry to be very, clear in what I'm saying, until we tackle the predominance of white supremacy and white supremacist thinking, which passes, by the way, for very, very normalized ways of thinking about even the term education. who are you telling needs educated? What are we trying to do here? But until we really challenge and unveil the very normalized white supremacy within our institutions, there's no point in thinking about diversity, because we just end up with the black and brown faces in high places who are absolutely willing to enact the same kinds of imperial powers that the state wants them. And I think we have to think more of the university at the moment as it's constituted as a microcosm of state power. And all we have to do is to look at how universities have been treating their students who have, in Calgary, they had rifles pointed right in their faces for protesting for the end to a genocide. And we're facing here in Canada the lie now that even the legal system is participating in, which is that universities are no longer public property, which they are, and so they're invoking the suspension of charter rights with these invented policies. So what is truth is shifting around, and who gets to say what that truth is being shifted around. So I always Sinanan writing in the 70s in Britain said, "We are here because you were there," and that remains a truism, that universities don't really want us, and here I'm using us to talk of global South and colonized subjects. They don't really want us to be here unless we're going to become diversified colonized subjects, much in the way that Macaulay's Indian Minute imagined reinventing the entire Indian education system to produce mimic men who do reenact colonial power. So diversity can't get us anywhere unless we tackle with these fundamental problems.
Thank you, Kerry.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could just, reiterate much of what's been said. But I mean, one thing that comes out of this discussion is the way in which power is implicated in diversity and such. And, just looking at my own university, it's interesting to see how that plays out. And it's not in any, obvious sort of way. I mean, we've seen generally an erosion of self-governance in the university. And yet, actually, my department is much more diverse now because of top-down initiatives. And so it took the provost to develop an anti-Black racism project that's actually brought several new colleagues teaching Black history to our students. And that's great, and it might not have come from below. That was a top-down initiative. There are many reasons for that. You'd like to think that the provost was an enlightened sort of individual, but I suspect it was due to political considerations and such. Power is always implicated in these questions of diversity. On the other hand, the universities are also deeply homogenizing institutions. Particularly the bigger they are and the more bureaucratic they are, bureaucracy works through homogenization. So when you're compiling reports and such, you're expected to kind of compile them in a homogeneous way so they can be compared with one another. And that's a major impulse of the modern bureaucratic university. And so, that's something that, we all have to contend with. And power then is flowing in different ways throughout the university.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will just ask maybe a couple of more questions, but I want to remind our audience to please send in your questions as and when you have them, and we'll take them up really very quickly. You can send them in the chat box if you want, or maybe later if you want to ask them. But continuing with the question of diversity and thinking about how we practically implement these things in our university spaces, we have heard a lot of calls about decolonizing research methods, our syllabi, and things like that. We have also, of course, heard calls for thinking through against with European perspectives and those kinds of things. So I wonder if our panel could address how you have taken up these suggestions in your work or in your teaching. Maybe a practical example or so that we could then also draw from and think about. Maybe we could start with Kerry. We've been starting with Gina for a bit now.
I'm sorry, is the question how we've taken up some of these questions in our own teaching? Can you just...
Teaching or research, whichever you choose to address.
Yeah, I mean, I might get a little bit repetitive, but yes, I mean, my goal is to undermine the 18th century as we understand it, and to challenge it. And it's incredibly, I will say it's very, I want to say how difficult that work is and how dangerous it is, and how it's put me, you know, up against very, very difficult conversations, even bringing instances of racism to people who are in charge of DEI within ASECS and CSECS, and to have had, you know, very, very little support. Actually, I'm saying this deliberately. I know it's probably controversial to say, but I think I just don't want to allow complacency to be part of this conversation. And so teaching these texts, teaching against the grain. So many 18th century scholars are citing Black studies thinkers, but not enacting the politics that go along with that thinking. And that's a huge issue for me, where I see people drawing on Christina Sharp or the important work of Saidiya Hartman to rethink things, or citing Indigenous writers like APES and others, and yet they're just diversifying their syllabi and not actually undoing some of the fundamental networks. So in my teaching, that's really the work. You know, Gina's journal, 18th Century Fiction, published a special issue that I co-edited with others on The Woman of Color, which is a novel that really shows Olivia, an olive-skinned mixed race woman whose mother is an enslaved woman, coming into Bristol society. And I lived in Bristol. I taught in the southwest of England for a long time. I was the only non-white faculty in a whole college of arts for 10 years. It was incredibly difficult. I've always had people asking me to take things off my syllabus to readjust what I teach. I've had people have whole special meetings to ask, you know, to say there's too many Black writers on your syllabus, and you know, this is the reality of trying to do some of this work. And I'm saying this because I know I'm not the only person who has these experiences on the ground, and actually many leave. Many women of color, many faculty, many Black faculty, especially Black women faculty, simply leave, or I will say also become sick and die. The mortality rates of Black women in academia remain incredibly high. I'm saying that deliberately as well. But I also want to name one of the other incredible paradoxes of the university right now in terms of the Enlightenment, which is that it's absolutely ignoring the science on COVID. And failing to protect students on a mass scale that I think is unconscionable. I will never go into a classroom without a mask, but I am teaching students who are visibly becoming more ill in front of my eyes, becoming ill with long COVID. And I'm teaching alongside colleagues who are also refusing to acknowledge the fact that we are in an ongoing global pandemic. The sociability of the conferences was pushed on us. I have not gone to an in-person conference since 2019. I'm sure there have been costs to that for me, but I personally refuse to participate in a project of refusing some of the actual things that the Enlightenment might have bequeathed us, which is the scientific fact that we know we are living with this airborne disease that is incredibly debilitating, and of course is affecting students of color much more harshly, and disabled students much more extremely. So when I teach the Middle Passage, and I teach what Equiano has to tell us about the slave ship's hold, I am always going to bring it back to the context of what we're living with now.
Thank you, Kerry. I don't know, Brian, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so the question is about diversity in your teaching and scholarship and such. And, I mean, I guess, when I saw that question, I thought, well, I thought about when I began as an assistant professor, how I was going to structure the courses that I would teach. And I really did find that, doing that meant that I had to work against the grain of much of the historiography that I had been educated in effectively, particularly in British history, which really was mainly English history. And so that was kind of the first thing. It seemed pretty obvious that I was, given a course on British and Irish history. I actually added the Irish myself because I thought, well, you need to study these two countries in conjunction with one another. But it meant effectively that I had to teach myself Irish history and I had to teach myself Scottish history as well, because that really hadn't been part of my educational experience. And that just continued for, I mean, even doing English history, I realized, well, can't do early modern English social history without thinking about the experiences of Black people in early modern England, the experience of Asian people in early modern England, all kinds of immigrant minority communities. This was just core to the work, and certainly gender history helped quite a lot on that count. The idea that gender history is simply central to doing history. It's there in just about every lecture. So rather than just having one set lecture, you just incorporate that into just about everything you do, whether you're talking about high politics, popular politics, social history, economic history. It's all there. And and that's what actually attracted me to the history of Britain generally, was not the celebratory mode, but the way in which Britain was connected to the rest of the world, particularly in the early modern period. And so you find that doing, particularly the history of that part of the world is a form of global history. Another, issue that's been on my mind lately is simply urban history. You wouldn't necessarily think of urban history as related to, diversity initiatives, but partly given the contemporary politics, the real attack on cities that we've seen in the United States, in Britain, and in Canada, certainly, the ways in which our cities are talked about in these really disparaging ways has made me think, well, we should teach these cities a little bit more and show how, London is a great example because it's always been a global city since the Roman Empire. And so doing, global history through urban history has been, a really interesting way of approaching that. I would say also that, certainly post 2020, so, the great, the journée of the year 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement, just did give me a chance to rethink what I was doing in my syllabi and making a little bit more of an effort to, particularly include Black history, I think, in British history, and doing that through emphasizing the history of enslavement and the slave trade. Certainly, it was never ignored, but I've just given it a little bit more prominence in these courses because it seems to matter. Certainly, and the students, want to learn about this. So, it's an ongoing process, certainly, and we're always engaging with the issues of the present day.
Yeah, I will agree entirely with Brian's point about that. We're always engaging with the present day. Teaching history is interesting because you think history, and I don't teach literature, I teach history courses, and one might think, well, it's the same thing year in and year out, but it's not. So for instance, I teach a course on the French and Haitian revolutions together, and they look really different every time I do. Every few years when I teach that course again, even though I'm still in the same temporal zone and geographic zone, they look different with the rise of Trump. They look different with the Black Lives Matter movement. They look different with COVID. All of those things reshape that, how I see them, how I teach them, and how we talk about them every time. So it's why teaching a subject doesn't get ossified in some ways. I don't consider it my job to tell them how to see the world. I mean, I don't try to impose a framework on what I do. I almost always offer multiple possible readings. I don't usually even ascribe them to different secondary authors. I'll sort of say one argument about the Haitian Revolution is this, another argument is that. And I offer different possible frameworks because I don't want to be in the position of sort of telling them how to read something, but I do want them to be able to come back and use those possible frameworks and then jump to the present. So sometimes we just get out of talking about the past, say, so how would this make you look differently at, say, the rise of the phenomenon of Trump in the United States or something like that, or vice versa? How does the rise of a potential authoritarian at home look like when you reread this thinking about Napoleon? You can kind of go both directions, but I do want them to be clear about what's in the past and what's in the present, even as they're constantly informing each other, the two. And I mean, there's a kind of pedagogy that simply challenges the dominant narrative as its major project, but I often think the students don't even know the dominant paradigm first in some ways, that the challenge only makes sense in light of knowing what's been said about it before. So for instance, to explain the French Revolution, even if I'm not going to offer you have to understand the Marxist reading of the revolution to understand the critique of the Marxist revolutionary reading, to understand the post-colonial critique of the Marxist critique. There's a sort of layers of, so I assume they don't know any of the above in some ways and offer a kind of plethora of possible frameworks and then try to work them out. I don't know if that could be described as explicitly a sort of diversity-oriented pedagogy, but it is intended to get them to be able to think about the most contentious issues on the table today in ways that might not have been possible without the reading and classroom discussion that came before.
Yeah, so I'll offer an example of an exercise that I do in my anti-colonial pedagogies course that I actually think, interestingly, is like another iteration of a classroom exercise that's built on this model that Sophia is describing of like trying to get students to understand the multiple layers of, history, ideology, cultural logic, like material investment that we are living in any given moment, and that we are witnessing, when we imagine people of the past or people of the future, right? That we are imagining people living in, because that is a kind of, that's a condition of living in a human and a human engineered world. But this involves another reading recommendation. So another text that I teach in this class, it's available, I'm pretty sure, for free as a PDF online. The title is A Third University is Possible. The author is La Paperson, L-A, and then Paperson, which is a pen name for the scholar and writer Cowan Young, who is, some people know as the co-author with Eve Tuck of the essay Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. But a third university is possible is kind of like, it's a short book or a long essay, and it lays out this thesis from a kind of anti-colonial perspective of the third university as the university that those of us doing academic work or somehow working within or with universities, should be positioning ourselves for, should be trying to position ourselves as, within. And very, very briefly, he defines the first university as kind of like the original colonial mandates of specific universities, what Kerry was citing early on in our conversation. So when this university was formed by this king, or by this governor, what was the first university is like, what was that organization told its mission was on the ground? Who was it serving? How was it serving that purpose, that power? The second university is kind of like broadly what we have right now in North America. It's what we might call the liberal university, right? Or the liberal arts college, if you're in the States. And this is the idea that these universities that had these original colonial mandates have now kind of grown or developed or, quote unquote, evolved to the point where they are no longer really serving those very specific original colonial mandates, but they're serving a broader purpose to educate. This is kind of the Enlightenment University, I think, the idea of the Enlightenment University. And that's, that work is what it is. You can be for it, you can be against it, you can be working within it, struggling within it. But the thing that defines the second university for Lotte Paperson is that while it devotes itself to this kind of higher thinking or this pursuit of scholastic intellectual truth, it doesn't pay a lot of attention to its own material kind of embroilment in material and political economies. Right. So it's this is the second university is where you can have a course called anti-colonial pedagogies, and yet the university itself remains invested in weapons manufacturers that are, complicit in actively, ongoing genocides around the world. So the second university is this kind of paradoxical creature. The third university is what is possible. And Lotte Paperson says you can catch glimmers of the third university in the first and second universities, which coexist right on top of one another. And the third university is kind of like what, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney call the undercommons. It's like the kind of rogue learning, and not always rogue learning. I mean, I'm thinking about, Brian, your comment that sometimes the most learning is done in the conversations after class, right? Or in office hours, which this also kind of, this intersects with what Harney and Moten are calling the undercommons. But that within the first and second universities, there really is kind of anti-colonial meaning-making, knowledge practicing, community formation. And the question is, how do we identify those sites? And how do we support them? How do we nurture them? How do we grow them? Especially those of us who are employed by the university, especially those of us who, at least in theory, are supposed to be the stewards of the university and its mission, right? So for my students, I do an exercise where we read A Third University as Possible. We have a discussion about what these three terms mean. And then I send them out onto the campus and I ask them to just walk around the campus. They can do it in groups if they want to, alone if they want to, and make observations, and then kind of report back on where you observed the first university. It's still there. It's evident in a plaque or in a statement or, something. Where did you see the second university? Right? What did that look like? What was happening? Who was participating? What, and then where did you see the possibility of the third university? And I get such varied answers from the students. I've done this course 2 years now, right? And I've learned a lot about the way that we're still living in an extended 18th century at McMaster University from my students' feedback in response to this assignment. So whether it's an 18th century course or any other course, I really do recommend this as the kind of exercise that can get students to a place where I'm thinking about Sophia talking about how the past and the present, they're not separate creatures. We're living in an unfolding of them because we're still living in colonialism. And this has been one of the things that I've done with students that really seems to have gotten us to a place where people are not just perceiving that, but kind of feeling it in the place where we are.
Thank you so much. Another recommendation I'll write down. And maybe it was our hope today to offer a door or an entryway to that third university you're just presenting by having this conversation. So time just flew by. We're already approaching the end of our time, but I would like to offer one last questions and maybe invite each of you to answer as briefly as you can, well, as completely as you can. We briefly alluded to the current political climate, the polarization. I think we have the US election in the background. We're thinking about the various conflicts maybe that we've seen happening on campuses everywhere in North America. I would like to ask you, are you optimistic that universities can offer environments that are at the same time intellectually stimulating, inclusive, welcoming to open inquiry and diverse perspectives? And do you think that the study of dead thinkers and writers of the 18th centuries represent an obstacle to that dream, or it can facilitate this realization? It can be a yes or no answer.
Well, I didn't get to answer the last question, so I'll maybe hop in and tie the two together. I'm definitely not optimistic because I'm a historical materialist. And, so whatever third university might emerge, but would have to be for me. I mean, Walter Rodney talks about the guerrilla intellectual, and he physically put his knowledge in the service of physical resistance and uplifting the poor, and the Enlightenment values of putative objectivity or neutrality are the handmaidens of white supremacy. And so this idea that we teach a range of different things and leave it to students to decide would be antithetical to how I understand my role as somebody who's coming from a counter-modernity, as Paul Gilroy puts it, background. And so I cannot say that there might be glimmers of a third university, but when somebody's literally paying 4 times the fees for that glimmer, it makes this question, well, how would we get that glimmer and put it somewhere else that it would no longer be within those historical material extractivist economies? So I'm going to just quote from a colleague and friend of mine, Jairo Funes, who was actually suspended by Texas Tech University and then reinstated for speaking out for Palestine. But if we think of what decoloniality might mean, and it's why I emphasized universities as colonial structures at the beginning, because decoloniality of being would consist, he says, of disrupting racial colonial discourses and dismantling the social practices, institutions, curriculum, and pedagogy that reproduce colonial relations of power, racial, social classification, and epistemic hierarchies. And so I suppose at the moment, the positive thing I can do with my students is a constant act of refusal of all of these narratives. And that's the space, the literature, two-side literature, that's the opening that we can make within these very, very oppressive structures that we find ourselves in.
All right,
Sophia?
I'll jump in next, and I will say it's funny we keep referring to colonialism, but very little to capitalism. They're not identical, of course. They're related, but they're not identical. And I think that the class dimension in all of this is equally important. Something we maybe for another conversation, but the questions about diversity sometimes end up marginalizing those questions in different ways that could come back into our conversation. But I will probably say that I'm not optimistic any more than Kerry is. I do think, though, that we can. I can't prognosticate. I can't exactly tell us where we're going. But I do think that university leaders and academics and even students need to make a stronger case for why the university or even the third university matters, as to why. And I think that one problem is that university leaders have become very defensive, that most of what they do even is to sort of protect themselves from lawsuits or from state legislatures or that sort of thing. There's very little positive case being made for why education matters, why pedagogy matters, why a wide range of a student body that's, for lack of a better word, diverse matters. And we do that perhaps in our academic work very effectively, but the public, we're not necessarily shaping the public discourse enough. And I think if there's any hope of reaching, I'll hold out hope, even if I'm not optimistic, but I'll hold out the hope for what Eugenia just very ably described as this kind of third possibility, based on the idea. It can only even become a glimmer if we start speaking to public spaces and making the case for why it matters and why we need a better future and why the future actually requires there to be education that matters, education that's critical, education that's not just about skills, but about thinking. A positive case for that seems to be a little bit lacking in our current world, and we'll need it to counter the ones that say that education is simply a waste of time.
Yeah, I guess I could go in next. I mean, I'm not very optimistic either. I keep thinking, I mean, and particularly the things that have been happening, in my city in the last, year or so has made me really think, well, what's the future of my employer? And what are we going to do? There's been, talk about, oh, well, we should move to Ottawa, we should move to Paris, we should, like do something, because our government, doesn't really want us, to do what we do. None of those solutions seem to make much sense to me. One of the things that that I keep coming back to, and I'm very trepidatious about this, but one way to globalize a university, to remove yourself from these political constraints, is to use the internet. So to use forums like the one we're using today. It has immense possibility for sure, and discussions like the one we're having today are great and might show us the way, dare I say, an enlightened, sociable conversation. We all know that that's not what you normally find on the internet, and that's a big problem. And so, and if you want to think about like, how could I be a historian outside of a university? Because maybe the universities are just going to focus on vocational training, and history majors are declining, and thankfully, actually not at my university, but at many other universities. Universities in the UK are looking at bankruptcy and closing down. So that's there we're seeing the end of the university in the 21st century, and that may just be the beginning of a continuing cascade of a retreat of the state from higher education. But demand for higher education is still there. I mean, I can clearly see that's the students want this, and they can get education. I mean, they are educating themselves. This is, not to be pessimistic, but to be optimistic for once. They are educating themselves, and there are lots of opportunities. A lot of it is enabled by the internet, by new technologies and such. But being able to navigate that is quite difficult, and there is it all seems to come down to this fiscal problem of to do it right is expensive, and it requires nurturing expertise, and the only way I can see that to do that efficiently is through the power of the state. States are extremely powerful institutions, for good or for ill. Often for ill, unfortunately. But I find it hard to find an alternative to the state. I couldn't do what I'm doing through a YouTube channel or such. I mean, well, I could, but it wouldn't be the same, and it wouldn't, it's probably not a sustainable model. If you look at the problems, and the professoriate isn't alone in this. This is a general 21st century crisis we're facing of, the denigration of knowledge work generally, the calling what we do content, as if it's all the same is, that's, a very impoverished way of looking at knowledge production for sure. But that's how the platforms, particularly the internet platforms that exist, think about what we do. That's what YouTube does. That's what Spotify does, and they don't pay their producers much of anything. I mean, at least universities, they may, exploit, many of their laborers, but, they do provide salaries, and so they are employers beholden by local laws and such to obey them. So there is a general crisis of 21st century knowledge production that universities are a part of, but they're also part of an even broader problem. And yeah, when I think about that, I'm rarely optimistic.
Finally, Eugenia, are you any more optimistic?
I'll jump in. No, I never feel optimistic. I never feel optimistic.
She said with a laugh.
Yeah. But I will say I've tried one of the ways I cope with like a general inaccess to optimism about all kinds of things is I've tried to become very specific in the way that I register for myself where I experience hope and where I experience hopelessness, on a sliding scale. And so I'll just list some of the observations I've made over the last year, kind of in this way. I completely agree with Brian that a lot of my hopeless moments are responses to just the massive intensification of the forms of corporate capture that working in the university entails these days. And this speaks to Sophia's point as well about capitalism. I should say, like in my anti-colonial pedagogies course, I'm very careful usually to say colonial capitalism or capitalist colonialism, and then always with like if we need to disentangle these, let's do that work. But I do think they really go hand in hand, at least in the historical context set by 18th century British, like globalizing agendas. And so just the fact that when I opened my email this morning, I had like invitations to 3 separate events for faculty for like talking about AI in the classroom, or like dealing with the crisis of AI and the blah blah. I'm not denying that this is a crisis that professional teachers and academics are encountering, particularly, I think, in the humanities and social sciences. But the fact that in our already, like when we get up to do our knowledge work, we have to open our email, like encounter that pile of, digital, like, whatever that's hurled at us every single day. And then the hours of the workday become increasingly captured by our apparent responsibility to go troubleshoot issues invented by tech billionaires who are trying to change the world in ways that will eliminate us, both as professionals and as human beings, right? Like that's not the job I signed on for. And yet that is the job of being a professional academic more and more and more each day, right? So that's a hopeless moment. I feel a lot of hope and joy when I go into my classroom for my anti-colonial pedagogies class. It's the only class I'm teaching this term. So it's not that class is the only one that gives me hope and joy, but that's where I encounter students this year. I feel a lot of hope when I spend time with our graduate students. They are teaching me constantly. They are so ready to do the work that we have invited them into the university to do. And they are looking for help figuring out how to actually get to the place where they can do that work, right? So that's hard, but that's something that I feel prepared to help out with, if not entirely solve for them. I feel hope in the solidarity I feel with early career academics of all stages and with students. I feel hope in the solidarity I feel with my colleagues who are similarly frustrated by the erosion of collegial governance structures, in the university. Like Brian, I'm at one of the very few Canadian universities where the faculty are not unionized. I feel hopeful when I hear colleagues say, I'm thinking about how maybe we need a union. Like that's hopeful to me. So yeah, this is not an exhaustive list. I just want to say that I think it's been very important for me to be able to imagine like what I was describing as like the mission of the university, which is also my mission as a person in the world and as a scholar and a writer and a thinker and a teacher. I've had to learn to imagine the ways that I can devote myself to those activities and those ways of being in relation that are not dependent on the institution of the university, because I am not at all optimistic that these institutions are going to continue to survive as sites devoted to the mission of learning. I mean, if they are even in the current moment, I think they still employ a lot of people who are devoted to that mission. But I don't feel optimistic about my job continuing to exist after it ends for me, or about, the professoriate as something that the culture is going to continue to invest in. So the job now is to think, okay, so where does if there's going to be a third university, where does it go? How does it form? How do I become an ancestor to that without trying to just replicate the world as I know it and I'm surviving it right now?
Well, thank you so much. And then thanks for inserting a few words of hope at the end. I think it offers a nice conclusion. And I would like to thank all of you again for this conversation that was so rich, provocative at times, and that opened so many doors that I think we'll have to meet again to go through the whole list of questions we had prepared for you, and we barely addressed maybe a third of them. So once again, Brian Cowan, Sophia Rosenfeld, Kerry Sinanan, and Eugenia Zuroski, thank you so much. Thanks also
Thank
to
you,
all
too.
thank you. Thanks also to all the listeners who are still here. If you have enjoyed today's conversation and would like to have more, you're invited to come back for our next event, which will take place on November 29th. So
Thank you so much.
Until then, I'll say thanks to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll continue the conversation pretty soon.